Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. So this will be the first part of our newest tutorial, which is a horse eye, the fur, and as well the tack of the horse. This will be the newest way I'm kind of doing tutorials on the channel. So for every time-lapse part, there will be a corresponding non-spoken, non-verbal full-length version. So every part will then to just break it down and make it a bit more manageable and easier, since these A4 tutorials can get quite long if it's a full on drawing. I've decided to split them up this way, have the full length version which you can reference, and then the spoken tutorial, which is a time lapse which basically shows you what's going on in that part. So all the details, the materials, the reference, and so forth will be listed down in the description box, as well as a link to the long form version. So this drawing starts out similar to most of my other drawings, and I start with the eye itself because it's kind of the central part of this drawing. So I put on a wash of graphite powder with a soft synthetic brush just to give myself a grey base to work off of. And now I'm taking a pencil and mapping out the most recognizable darker areas, which defines the eye as well as the reflections within. So this one you can easily do whilst mapping out the drawing itself, but I prefer to add these as I start my shading process. So once I am happy with these initial parts of the drawing that I've added with the pencil, I will go in with the blending stump and just blend it all out and add another layer of powder. So similarly to what we did with the pencil, I will now take my mono eraser, which will then add the most defining highlights within the drawing. So this is just to kind of balance out what I'm already doing and further define the shape, and it's more of a guideline or a map as to what the shape will entail, where all the most important areas are. So once I'm done with that, I'll restart the process and go back with my pencils. This time it's a 2B, which then I use to further define the areas, build up the values, and also further map out and define the reflections within the eye. So this is quite a close-up view of the eye, so you can add quite a few details within the reflections itself. But you can, if you want to, you can easily break them down into the most basic values if you don't want the full picture within the reflection. So this is kind of what I'm choosing to do, is I just want to add the basic values and shapes. I don't want to define the actual shapes and make them recognizable. So to me, reflections are just the stark differences in your values with no true blending within your darkest and lightest. However, your midtones will still have to be blended with no stark lines. So we are moving on, and every layer is just a continuation of the previous. So the process of adding pencil, then blending it, is continuous and will happen every single time. And with most layers, I will add a wash of powder before redefining my highlights, as I'm doing here. So the main reason for this and not leaving the highlights just the paper peeking through is that your highlights need to have depth as well, and highlights have to interact with the values surrounding them. So highlights are kind of the main example of one of the reasons why I do the layering process the way I do it, is I prefer to build my highlights along with other values and remove them as I go, with some being removed more than others during that whole process. So you need to create subtle differences within your values, within your highlights itself, and that will then add to that illusion of depth and realism. So if you look at most drawings, even your darkest areas, your shadowed areas, and even within the midtones themselves, there will be highlights, but it will be a highlight within relation to the values around it. So that is why I like to do that continuous process, and it integrates the highlights and the shadows with everything in itself and just creates that smooth look, and like I said, that illusion of depth, and also adds to that realistic effect. So here I am back with my F pencil, and this is basically my way of saying that every layer does not need to be an increase in grade or darkness of the pencil. So I like to switch back and forth between pencils, and this basically is another way to blend out the pencils that you've already put down. And it's also a way to create unique values that you don't get from your standard set. And this will create those subtle changes within the values that also add to the depth and the realism. So in this case, I used an F pencil first, then a 2B, then an F again. So the F will then allow me to also fill in the gaps that the 2B created. So my paper has a grain to it, which I prefer. It also means that the paper can take quite a lot of layers, which is important if you want to do this type of drawing where you don't just, add 1 or 2 layers and then call it a one and done kind of thing. So that way I can fill in kind of the little gaps that is created by the 2B pencil being a little softer. It's more noticeable with your darker B pencils, but that way I just fill in the gaps and it makes it ever so slightly darker than it was before. So there again is that creation of that slight addition of depth, a slight darker value. So if you put the 2B next to the 2B with the F pencil, it will be slightly darker. So now for areas around the eye, I choose to also add a layer of powder first. But because the area is larger than the eye itself, I would rather use a blending stump with powder on it than a pencil to define the contours. So generally I then tend to add another layer of powder over top of that before going in with a mono eraser to define the highlighted areas around the high points. So generally when I take the mono eraser, I will start at the lightest areas and work my way out to the highlights that are a bit deeper in depth. So that way I have my starkest contrast and lightest areas with a clean eraser, and then the eraser will kind of do my little subtle differences in the values for me by not taking away as much pencil. You can obviously dictate this with pressure as well. So only after those 2 steps, the adding the powder and blending and the mono eraser, do I go in with a pencil and use it in the same manner as the blending stump, where I further define the contours and add more depth. So even though these are 2 different textures, the eye and the fur itself, I tend to start everything the same way. And that's just because I want that foundation layer, to me, is a way of starting the depth, building the contrast, and also defining the shape. To me, I don't need a quick result to get what I want. I have the patience. I kind of prefer the slow go method because I tend to miss things in the beginning stages, or I just kind of miss a proportion or a shape or something. And this way it just eases me into the drawing and what I'm drawing. This is specifically very important when you're drawing something new. To me, horses, extremely familiar subject. So to me, it's a lot quicker process generally, these initial stages, than it would be maybe something else. So here's where it becomes a bit different than the eye. So it's more of a back and forth movement with your pencil. Very much the same types of pencils that I use within the eye itself. It's just there will be a much larger pencil section or pencil layer than in the eye. So this is me just defining the kind of direction of the fur and also creating some very rough texture that will be blended out into the layers as I go along. So this is another continuation of my kind of slow approach, and details are, I think I've said this countless of times in all my other tutorials, but details to me are a very final step and is a building up process as you go along. So I like to approach my details as I do depth. So I like to bring them slowly to the forefront. I first want to have the correct values before I add those finer details. And those finer details pertains not only to those finer lines or very small intricate little additions that makes the drawing very realistic, but it's also to me those defining shadows and the highlights. So I will approach this for every type of drawing the same way. So no matter what details I'm drawing, it will always look the same, or it will always start out the same way. So for me, it's always very out of focus, blurry at the start. It's very soft and blended, and then with every layer it becomes more into focus. There's much more visible difference, maybe a starker line here and there, much more larger range of values, punchier values, and lots of depth and highlight. So that's the way I bring everything into focus before I then start with that final detail layer. So a good example of this kind of method is the lashes above the eye. So those are one of those details where I want to draw what's underneath them first, so that once I define them, they aren't just like white marks on the paper that looks out of place and not part of the animal. So I will, with every layer, kind of subtly define them. And they will look out of focus. They're kind of there, they tell me where they are in this space, and that way they will be slightly out of focus, but this allows me to be more heavy-handed with my application of my powder and my pencil around them, so that I don't have to work around them, and that it feels almost like the lashes do sit on top of something that is smooth and blended, and that there is a gradient of values. So that's a method how I can create those gradients without having to worry too much about keeping a certain area just a blank space of paper. And I have done this countless of times before, and I do know that my mono erasers can create that very kind of bright white, but because there are layers of powder and pencil underneath, it will be a bright white that makes sense to that drawing at hand. So it won't be just like if you would go in with a white gel pencil, a pen, or maybe a Posca marker or something that's very, very white. It will be a white with a slight gray tinge to it, because there's so many layers of powder and pencil underneath it that it will look white in contrast to everything around it, but it won't be a stark white as to detract from the realism and the cohesion of the drawing itself. So with these fur layers, with the pencil and the mono erasers, I want to create the lines of the fur in the direction that they're going. That way, once I build up the layers and I get that kind of build of depth of the texture itself, the texture runs in the direction the fur will be going at the end. So you don't want to add details on top of fur that's going the completely wrong direction because you did cross-hatching and didn't blend it out properly. So all my applications of the mono eraser is to define not only kind of the foundation texture of the fur, but also to help guide me in the contours of the fur and also the direction in which it's going. So here I'm just adding another layer with a larger brush. That way it just kind of diffuses everything, takes away that kind of very stark contrast, and just allows me to blend it a bit more and build it up slowly. So everything remains out of focus and you get the continuation of depth, light, and everything in between. So for these initial layers, I also use a very small range of pencils. I don't think I went above a 2B. For the darkest areas in the eye, I did go in with a 6B, but that was quite a large jump from 2B to 6B. But that's just because it was the very darkest areas and it defines the shape of the eye. So here I'm now just taking my largest brush with powder on it, adding a wash of it to that entire side of the face on the eye side of the tack. And now I'm just taking my largest blending stump and defining the contours within the face. So that will be any kind of veins that are visible, you know, the bone structure, everything that defines the face of the horse. And you would see it kind of comes together very quickly in this method. It's not, you're not wasting pencil, and the powder is just a very quick way of adding a little bit of depth, and that way you can see very quickly whether or not you actually going in the correct path with your shapes. So if you weren't using the grid method like me and you were completely freehanding it, this kind of stage will be where you would play around to see if you've got your portions correct. So I also want to preface this by saying that if you chose to do this drawing, I should have probably said it at the beginning, but you don't have to do the kind of whole A4 of this drawing. I kind of like the angle of it, so I chose to do the full view, but you can easily make it into kind of where it is now. You can kind of do it in this format, but there's lots of interesting kind of, I like drawing the veins and the stuff because it's an interesting way to learn how to draw fur going in certain directions and moving quickly into another way, and that kind of blend of highlights to shadows and creating that smooth kind of rounded edge that veins tend to have, and doing that along with the fur. So that's where my foundational layers are very important, and where those final details really benefit from having a correct foundation underneath. So here I'm back to the area surrounding the eye itself. So I've already built up a bit of layers around this. So I'm starting to work in a bit smaller sections. So every small section I'll kind of use that layering process of pencil, blend, mono eraser, and then maybe move along to something else. So I'm not one of those artists that likes to complete an area of a drawing before moving along. So I like to use kind of the values of the entire drawing to define those final shadows and highlights. So I tend to work generally a bit darker and also not as stark contrast as some references will have. So this will be a very good example of that. So if you've seen the reference, you would know that the fur is very, very highly contrasted and exposed, and I will not be drawing it that way. So you can easily kind of avoid certain blending steps that I will take to have more of a muted value difference and not have such a stark contrast. In the beginning, it will kind of look like that stark contrast, but that's not my drawing style, so I'll generally tend to have it have a darker base value, darker foundational value, than having it so stark and white. So this drawing is actually a very good example. The fur in itself is a very good example of building depth and contrast without it feeling like you did the bare minimum and just use the papers, kind of the white of the paper, to your advantage. Or yeah, so that with those lighter areas you can still create that illusion of depth within the drawing. So we are basically nearing the end of the first part of this tutorial. It's a very basic way of how I start most of my drawings. So this tutorial is kind of a baseline for any tutorial that will be on my channel or that was on my channel kind of recently. There's a kind of a time where I didn't have graphite powder. I think with most of my tutorials I did. So it's going to be a very similar starting point for everything. Even with the next part where we kind of go towards the tack, it will be the same. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you find it useful and that you will enjoy this tutorial. So happy drawing everyone, and I'll see you all for the next one. Cheers!